The French Revolution and Napoleon is a unit that's pretty long. You can see that we're going to talk about the years from 1789 to 1815 and beyond. So quite a long story, so let's get started. The causes of the French Revolution can kind of be summed up in 5 different ways. The first one, and probably the biggest one, is the discontent of what was called the Third Estate in France. In France, society was divided into 3 different categories or social classes called estates. The first estate was made up of all the clergy, and they were really pretty powerful, pretty much equal to the king, sometimes even more powerful depending on the situation. The second estate was made up of the king and all nobility, and then the third estate was everybody else. So you have this huge range of people in the third estate. You could be the poorest of the poor, or you could actually be pretty wealthy, just not of noble blood. So the third estate is a giant estate and makes up more than a great majority of France. And we'll find out why they were so upset here in just a minute. But just know that there's 3 social classes, and the third estate is the one that is the largest by far. The second reason is they were having economic woes. We talked about Louis XIV and how he called himself the Sun King and built the Palace of Versailles and was so well loved and ruled for 72 years. And under his rule, he was a master at economic issues. He knew how to spend lots of money and make lots of money so that it was always a fair and equal balance. But when he passed away, his grandson is going to take over, Louis XV. And Louis actually started out at the age of 5. He was 5 when his grandfather died, the Sun King. So Louis didn't rule all by himself for quite a while, and he was very much a beloved figure. Actually, his nickname was Louis the Beloved for a very long time until he became a full-grown adult and took over. And it just seemed like the minute that he took over France, things started going downhill. He was not good at balancing the books. He spent a lot but made little, and France just started going downhill. So by the time that his son takes over, the Louis that we're going to be talking about in this unit, Louis XVI, it was not a good situation in France. People were having really, really hard times. So the economic woes actually started with the expenditures of Louis XIV, who knew how to float them, and then his grandson, who kind of followed in his footsteps and didn't know how. The third reason is the weak leadership of Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. Now, this is where the story gets almost fantastic. These two took power when they were 17 and 18 years old. Maybe 18 and 19, I'm not positive, but they were teenagers. Louis did not want to rule. He just wanted to fox hunt. That's all he was ever interested in. He didn't really appreciate women. It's not that he was homosexual. He just really had no sexual drive or orientation at all. He just wanted people to leave him alone, and he wanted to fox hunt. But here he is, made king, whether he likes it or not, and he was told, as king, you must have a wife. So Marie Antoinette, she started out as kind of a tomboy, but as she got older and her parents made her go through classes on how to be a perfect lady, and as she grew older, she also got more and more beautiful. She started to think that all men in the world would just fall at her feet and do whatever she wanted. And basically they did. She got her way with men and was a little bit loose with some of them, flirtatious more than anything else, but she just came to find out rather young that beauty got you anything you wanted. And so she thinks she's going to be the queen of this country, and she agrees to marry Louis, all excited that great things are going to happen for her. And when she met Louis, she knew right away that this man was not a social butterfly. He was really boring, to be honest, and he did not kiss her hand and fall over her and, beg for her attention. She ended up being the one begging for his attention. And on the wedding night, as was tradition then, members of the political entourage gathered around the newly wedded couple's bed and waited for them to consummate the marriage. And basically, Louis rolled over and said, "Not tonight, come back another time." So Marie, of course, was just mortified. And the next night they came back and they did this again and again and again for months. And Louis just seemed to not have any appreciation for Marie or desire for her at all. And Marie was devastated. Here she's beautiful and he's, kind of squatty and had lots of facial moles and not a good personality. And she's thinking, who is this man not to be in love with me? I'm beautiful. I know this picture doesn't show it very well, but she actually was considered one of the most beautiful women of her time period. So you can imagine how devastated she was that this, kind of ugly little dude just wasn't paying any attention to her. And finally, an advisor of Louis came to him and said, "Look, if you're going to be the ruler of France, we have to fix this. There are serious issues with your rule if you can't make love to your wife and have an heir." So Louis finally confided in him that there was something wrong with him, that whenever he got sexually excited, it actually caused him a lot of pain. And they went to a doctor and got him operated on, and eventually the pain went away, but he never was like a sexual tiger. They ended up having 4 children, but there is a lot of doubt as to whether all 4 of them are actually his. Marie will wander quite a bit because Louis is never going to be affectionate through their entire marriage and through his short life. Again, he just wanted to hunt foxes. That's it. So people saw them as a very odd couple, and she is kind of flighty. She's not very intelligent. He's antisocial, and it's just their personality quirks. But the people of France look at it as they felt that the king and queen were snubbing them, and they did not appreciate that. They also spent lots and lots and lots of money. Louis on his fox hunting trips. Marie, as she felt that Louis was not interested in her, she kind of became addicted to ways to make herself more beautiful. She had thousands of pairs of shoes, dresses that had real diamonds and sapphires and rubies sewn into them so that she would walk outside and they would reflect the sun and make her look beautiful. She also got into hats. Some of them were as tall as 4 feet and had live birds in them or real food. Very, very odd. But she was looking for attention and wasn't getting it. So she just kind of got odder and odder. And as she was doing all these things to make herself beautiful for Louis, who couldn't care less, she was spending like crazy. So it was more... The people of France, especially the women, really hated Marie Antoinette. And that old line about somebody said the people of France are starving, and she said, "Well, let them eat cake." It was supposed to be a slap in their face because the staple food of France back then was bread. And she supposedly was saying, "Well, let them eat cake," like they could afford bread and cake. It was kind of a slap in the face. She was not smart enough to have ever said that. She really wasn't. I'm not being flippant. She really wasn't. So, but the women, that rumor got spread all the way back then in the 1700s, and the women just absolutely hated her. I mean, they just were ready to start a cat fight any moment that this woman looked at them crossly, and she had no idea. She did not know that women felt that way about her. But here she is dressed, literally in jewels from head to toe, and they can't afford bread for their family. So they look at her as, kind of the evil, witchy ruler. So that's kind of the story of Louis and Marie, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. Also, one of the causes of the French Revolution is going to be the influence of Enlightenment ideas. So you already have America, who took the Enlightenment ideas from European countries, including France, and used them to fight their own revolution. Just a few years before the French Revolution is going to break out, and they succeeded. So those Enlightenment ideas of Rousseau that says, if your government is bad, you have a right to overthrow it. This is what the French people are thinking about, and they're looking at America and see that they succeeded in overthrowing a bad government, and it gives them lots of ideas. The American Revolution is the 5th cause, and it's not just the idea that we won, but the French actually loaned America a lot of money to fight the British, a lot of money, and never paid it back. So France was having a lot of their economic woes was not just because of the rulers. It was also because we owed them money and we weren't paying it. So it was just in addition to the economic issues that they were already facing, and it was our fault. So let's talk about the actual events of the French Revolution and how it came to be. The first one I'm going to talk to you about is called the Estates Generales and the Tennis Court Oath. So Louis wanted to change taxes. Actually, he wanted to increase them because Marie needed more high heels and hats with birds and, crazy dresses and all that great stuff. So in order to get a tax increase, he had to have approval from the Estates Generales. Now, the Estates Generales was a collection of all three of those social classes that I told you about, the first, second, and third estate. So again, you have the clergy as the first, the king and the noble is the second estate, and everybody else is the third. But this is where it's a little bit weird, and why they set it up that way, I can't quite understand. Members of the Estates Generales were allowed to vote only within their social class or their estate. So each estate got one vote, one for the clergy, one for the nobles, and one for every single person in the third estate. So you have three total votes coming out of it. So you can see why the third estate is going to get upset at this. They're the ones that are going to have to pay the taxes. The nobles and the king and the church won't have to pay the taxes. It's always going to come out of the third estate. And with there always only being three votes, and the third estate being this monstrous group of people, and the first and second estate being very small, being very rich, it's always first and second estate against the third estate. And in this one meeting to vote about increasing the taxes, and they just had enough. They put their vote in, and again it was 2 against 1, and the vote to increase the taxes was going to go through, and the third estate said, we're not doing this. And several leading members of the third estate stood up and said, we are declaring ourselves the National Assembly, and we want change. We don't want to be part of the Estates Generales. We are going to change it. We're going to make an assembly, the National Assembly again, and we want change. And Louis, being the immature little child that he was, said, get out, and he locked the doors and wouldn't let them back in. And for 3 days, members of the new National Assembly kept coming back to the room of the Estates Generales asking to be let in, and Louis would not let them in. He's like a little kid. So the Estates Generales ends up moving to a building not too far down from, it's not the Estates Generales anymore, it's the National Assembly. Moved down the road a little bit from the offices of the Estates Generales, and it was a tennis court that they found, an indoor tennis court. And this is a pretty accurate drawing of the tennis court. So they gathered there, and these are mostly middle-class people, also called bourgeoisie, upper middle-class kind of people. They gathered at the tennis court and said, we're not going to leave this tennis court until we get a new constitution for France. So that's the tennis court oath. They're literally standing in a tennis court, and their oath is, we're not leaving till we get a new constitution for France, one that is fair to everybody. So after days and days and days, and the number of the people in the tennis court growing, by the third day, it's not just bourgeoisie, it's peasants, it's all kinds of people. And members of the first and second estate figured if they didn't join them, they might burn down the Estates Generales building. So they joined them. Louis eventually joined them too. And before the people left the tennis court, a new constitution for France was actually born. So now that the people won getting the new constitution for France, that word got out very, very quickly to the peasants, and you can see right on time. You can hear my alarm, my grandfather clock going off to introduce you to the first real event of the French Revolution. The French consider this the very first event, and it is the storming of the Bastille. And it took place, here you see on the screen in front of you, July 14th, 1789. That is their Independence Day. So ours is July 4th, theirs is July 14th. And again, it's because news of that National Assembly and what they had done got out in France. And it encouraged the peasants. Now, this isn't the bourgeoisie, this is the peasants to rise against the power of the nobility. And they kind of figured out if they needed, if they were going to have a revolt, they needed ammunition. And there was an old armory called the Bastille that was also used as a prison in France, and they decided that they were going to storm the Bastille, and that's what they did. So little did they know that the Bastille had actually been cleaned out. There wasn't any ammunition stored there, and the peasants broke the door down and climbed up the narrow, very narrow staircases, and the people attacked and overwhelmed the king's soldiers, but 98 invaders ended up being killed because the invaders didn't have, or the peasants didn't have any real weapons. And 98 invaders ended up getting killed by the king's soldiers. One soldier does die, but it's because he fell as people were running back down the staircase, and he was trampled to death on accident. So this doesn't discourage people. This actually fires them up even more, because now you have 98 innocents, in quotes, innocents dead because of the French government and the king's soldiers. So this is considered the first main event of the French Revolutionary War. Now, not long after all of this takes place, the tennis court oath and the storming of the Bastille, there is a very famous document written, Declaration of the Rights of Man, and it is the first document issued by the National Assembly. So as a formal group now, remember, this is the Third Estate. They broke away from the Estates Generale. They are their own entity now, and they call themselves the National Assembly. And they ask a man by the name of Marquis de Lafayette, who had served as an officer under George Washington in the American Revolutionary War. He was also a great writer, and they asked him to write this document. The cool thing about Lafayette is when he came back from fighting in the Revolutionary War alongside George just loved him. He had a letter in his pocket from George, the first president of the United States, recommending him for any job that the young man wished to take on, and that held a lot of power back then. Everybody knew who George Washington was. So anyway, he was asked to write this document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and it stated that all men, underline men, are born free and equal and with natural rights. See, that's Enlightenment. John Locke said natural rights of life, liberty, and property. So all men are born free and equal and with natural rights. It also stated that men, only men, had the right to a voice in their government. So it is progress. It is progress for France, just not for women, because the women are still going to be left out of it, just like they always have been. But it is a step forward. All right, still talking about some of the events of the French Revolution. Let's get to the execution of Louis and Marie. Again, don't forget that Louis was 19 when he took control. Marie was 18. It was about 15 years before the French Revolution broke out. And the year that the revolution broke out in 1789, Marie and Louis had just lost one of their children, their son. So it was not a good time for either one of them. They were devastated at the death of their son. And in order to compensate for her grief, Marie was spending more than she had ever spent before. No one trusted Marie by this time. In fact, her third and fourth child, the peasants demanded that she give birth in the front gardens at Versailles in public, outside in public, to prove that the babies actually came from her. And at the height of the greatest pain of giving birth, they were to ask her who the father was to make sure that she said Louis. Back then, they really believed that women couldn't lie. at the height of birth, that was just something that was totally impossible. So whoever, if you were asked the question, who's the father of your child, at that moment, the greatest pain, you couldn't lie. So they just trusted her that much. They made her give birth in front of everybody and claim who the father was. So do not like her at all. And in 1791, a mob of angry women, almost all women, they had gone down to the local market, and bread had doubled overnight. Remember, that's their staple diet. So the price of bread had doubled, and these angry women said, we're not going to take it anymore, and they stormed Versailles. And basically, they kidnapped the royal couple and their children, the 3 children that were left. And their goal was to take them into Paris. So this is 1791. And so Louis and Marie are only going to rule for about 15 years or so before the start of the French Revolution. And these women, they were joined by some men later. And as they're marching them to Paris, Louis and Marie and the children escaped. But Marie had been adamant that her husband was the King of France, and that all money coming out of France should have his face on it. So a local peasant, by his money, having money in his pocket, knew what the king looked like. And as they're trying to escape, this peasant pointed out King Louis, and they were captured again. So their attempt failed, and this made them traitors. So Louis is brought into Paris with Marie and the children. Children are kept separate from Louis and Marie. They're both put in jail cells. Louis was forced to accept a new constitution that would make France a constitutional monarchy. Remember, we talked about that with England. So now whoever ruled after Louis, of course, because Louis is not going to rule anymore, they would have to rule in conjunction with Parliament and through the permission of Parliament. But even though he signed it and they had them in jail, and there could have been a trial, a very long drawn out trial, people just really believed that in order for the revolution to succeed, the royal couple had to die. That they had to make a statement that evil rulers would not be allowed to rule. So the monarchy was officially abolished in 1792, and France was declared a republic. Louis was executed that following year in 1793. Now, Marie was kept around for another 9 months. Remember, the women hated her. So she was stripped, of course, of all her beautiful dresses. They basically dressed her in a sack and kept her around for 9 months, and people were allowed to come and visit her, and they did horrible psychological things to her. They would come and give her messages from her children that the children hated her. They would come in and say that they were teaching their children that she was a bad person and that she had never loved them. And Marie was a lot of things, not nice things, but she was a good mother, and she loved her children. And she actually had a small farm built behind the Palace of Versailles where she and the children could live in private quite often, and she could teach them how to grow gardens, and they could live in peace without being in the limelight all the time. She did love her children, as eccentric and weird as she was, but this hatred for her was so horrible that they kept her alive for 9 months, basically to torture her. And in the end, they brought her out, took her up on the podium to have her beheaded. And normally, when they have you beheaded, even with the guillotine, which was being used by then, they would pull your hair up and pull your clothes back away from the spot on your neck that was going to be where it was going to be chopped. So it would be one quick, humane chop, and that would be the end of it. But they actually undid her hair so that it was falling about her shoulders, and they had to do more than one chop. And I'm sure that they did it, the leaders did it to satisfy the angry women of the crowd. And it's just a very sad story that Marie had to go through that, and she really was just kind of a simple, stupid little girl. But that was it. Louis and Marie were both gone. Now, I do want to introduce you to the newest death machine of the day before we move on, because this machine is going to be a really big deal after the death of Louis and Marie. The guillotine was made in 1792, and it was made by a guy named Joseph Guillotine, and it's spelled just like the guillotine that you see here on your screen. So it was done in 1792, the year before Louis was killed. So Louis and Marie were both beheaded with the guillotine here. And he did it, Joseph Guillotine did it because he thought that it was a more humane way to treat people, that even if people had done bad things, they didn't deserve, their last moments on earth to be painful and torturous. But the people who came to see the shows wanted it to be painful and torturous, and actually hated Joseph Guillotine for his invention, because once it was developed, you got one quick slice, the head falls into the basket, they close the basket lid, boom, it's done. They didn't like that. Remember with Charles I, people were allowed to come up and dip their hankies in his blood and see his head. They would hold his head up above the crowd, and this is the king, he is dead, blah, blah, blah. That's not happening now. And it happened so fast with no gore that the people who thought of this as entertainment, which was most people at the time, believe it or not, they didn't have the movies back then or TV, so all they had was this kind of stuff, and it was so fast now that people actually complained. But once you found this humane way to do it, you couldn't go back again. So just know that the guillotine is going to be used for all the deaths after Louis and Marie. Now that brings us to the Reign of Terror. During the French Revolution, a committee was formed, and you see here it's called the Committee of Public Safety, and it was headed by a man by the name of Robespierre. Robespierre took over at the death of Louis and began this reign of terror to eliminate enemies of the revolution. So according to him, anybody that was considered an enemy of the revolution, you could load them up in a cart, and he did. He loaded them in carts by hundreds sometimes, and they were all walked up on stage and beheaded one at a time by the guillotine. Just in Paris now, there were thousands of people killed all over France. Just in Paris, there were 3,000 people killed. That's where we have the best records. So we're pretty sure about the numbers there, and the numbers that came down was that 85% of those killed in Paris were from the Third Estate. These are people that wanted the French Revolution. So you're going to learn a lot about Robespierre in this unit, a lot beyond right now, but keep in mind that he had gotten to the point where he just was so far into this, it became this almost like Cold War Red Scare fear that everybody was against the revolution and everybody was against Robespierre, and it created this hysteria. So this goes on for about a year, the Reign of Terror, and leaders suddenly began fearing that Robespierre might turn on them. So they arrested him. They actually broke into his chambers and shot him in the face, so that he couldn't even speak. And it didn't kill him, though. He was executed himself by the guillotine, just like all the other people had been because of him. And with him, the Reign of Terror, with his death, the Reign of Terror is going to end. Now, let's learn a little bit more about Robespierre. Robespierre was originally a lawyer, and he was elected as deputy of the Estates Generale, and it was kind of surprising to him. He was kind of a quiet guy, but once he started getting into the real politics of it all and the unfairness of what was happening in France, and he truly loved France, he just really got swept up in it. And eventually he's going to openly attack the monarchy and support democracy. He read a lot of books about enlightened thinkers, and he was really, really all about democracy and fairness to the people. Now, this is in the beginning. So after the execution of Louis, members of the National Convention ended up splitting over what to do next. The group that was led by Robespierre called themselves the Jacobins, and they were this very, very violent group. And they were feared pretty much by everybody. And after that, they used mob tactics to overthrow the members of the convention who did not agree with them. So in other words, they got large groups of people to go into their homes sometimes, kidnap them, and behead them. Even if they didn't behead them, they did arrest them. And he begins slowly removing all signs of monarchical rule. He even had decks of cards reprinted without the image of kings and queens. Each one of the kings actually represents a king in history. I can't remember who they all are. I know that one is King Alexander. I can't remember who the other three are, but he didn't even want the kings on the face of cards. So he also despised the power of the church and closed all the churches in Paris and took Sunday off of the calendar. So you can see how this guy had really become a fanatic almost overnight, and that change in him scared people. So once they got a chance and they got enough people on their side, they knew that they had to get rid of Robespierre. And again, he's going to have the same fate that he sentenced Louis to. So following Robespierre, France was obviously going to be ready for peace. The National Convention created a Congress and an executive branch. The executive branch became known as the Directory. Now, they're not going to have a president because, like a presidential position where there's one guy. People were afraid of that. They had gone through a lot of rulers who had this massive amount of control. Even Louis XIV, who people didn't look back on as a bad ruler, he was the person in charge, and everybody didn't want that anymore. So the Directory actually consisted of 5 men. They figured that it would keep keep the other ones from becoming corrupt. And to be honest with you, the members of the Directory were corrupt in their own little ways, but they brought order and peace to France. They were in it to make money, and they were willing to be bribed, but only to a certain degree. So they do calm things down, and they start making decisions for France. How do we become a constitutional monarchy? And one of their first jobs ended up being to select a new general to command the French army. You can't be a powerful government without having a powerful military. 5 years later, that same general is going to overrun the Directory and wipe them out of existence. And of course, the name of that general was Napoleon Bonaparte. And you can see here the picture of Napoleon. Very, very different kind of guy. Napoleon was only 5'2". He was ambitious and energetic. He had great skills in organization. And to top it all off, he was a great military strategist, but he was also willing to sacrifice his own men for the completion of a plan. And he did several times. He left all of his men to die. He took off with the justification that he was a leader and needed to be saved to fight again another day, but it was okay to leave his men behind. Now, as the Directory began to become more and more and more corrupt, they kind of really dissolved themselves. Napoleon was waiting in the wings for it to happen and kind of nudged it. And as the Directory was officially dissolved, Napoleon just seized power in a coup d'etat, or a stroke of state. And that was in 1804. His most famous phrase about that day was, "I found the crown of France lying on the ground, and I picked it up with my sword." So in other words, nobody else was interested in it, but if they had been, I would have struck them down and taken it anyway. Napoleon did do a lot of good things for France, and really for Europe too. He's not my favorite leader. I think he was kind of a coward, and I think a lot of times he was in the right place at the right time to look like a hero. But that's just my opinion. But I'm going to tell you some of the things he did do that ended up being good things for France, and like I said, for Europe as well. He created something called the Napoleonic Code, and that was a system of laws that influence even our modern legal system, where everyone is treated equally before the law. And it was written codes, clear, concise, easy to understand. Whatever the crime was, the punishment, here's the punishment. I mean, it was pretty easy to read. He also established banks and public education, something that we borrowed, and he resolved the conflict between church and state. He separated church and state, just like Voltaire had been saying, you can't have a government where church and state are entwined. And at this time in France, they were still heavily entwined and causing lots of problems, so he separated them. He brought France peace. a stable government, and he brought them economic prosperity. I can't take that away from him. Napoleon did vow to unite all of Europe under France, and you can see here the map. In 1811, France is the darker purple, and all the territory that he gained, it was France at the time. The lighter purple is places that he was taking over. Now, every time he took over a new place, he placed members of his family as monarchs in the countries that he conquered. So he didn't have the monarchs killed or anything. When he took over Spain, he didn't have the monarchs there killed. He just had them removed. Sometimes they were held as like friendly prisoners in castles, highly guarded, so there wouldn't be a coup to overthrow him. But they weren't mistreated, and they definitely weren't killed. And everywhere that he took over, he made them use the Napoleonic Code. This was good for a lot of countries. A lot of countries that didn't have a decent or fair law code is now going to have one under Napoleon's rule. And even after he is gone years later, they're going to keep that same code. So he did do things that helped everybody. One of the things that he did that we are highly affected by today is he kind of created that idea of nationalism, or love of one's country in the people that he conquered. He started with France, calling France the mother country. We are French. We are better than anybody else. We deserve this. We deserve that. It's us versus them. He created this. And think about how the world is today. We are all like that. America more than anybody. Up until this point, the idea that you belonged to a certain country really wasn't a widespread idea. You were more a local kind of person. If somebody asked you where you were from, you went to visit a person far away, you probably wouldn't say, I'm an American. You would say, I'm a Virginian, I'm a West Virginian, I'm a North Carolinian, or you might even say, I'm a Berkeley Spring person. I belong to Berkeley Springs. People weren't thinking countrywide, and he brought that idea to life. It's a good thing and a bad thing, because it does make you do good things for your country and want to keep your country whole, but it does create that us versus them. In every place that he took over, the idea of nationalism spread, and the Spanish he took over said, well, we're Spanish. Why would we want to be overrun by the French? So it starts all kinds of new ideas. All right, Napoleon once more. He takes over all the land that I showed you, but he just cannot get over. He can't get to the point where he says that's enough. So Britain, he was kind of hesitant about going after because there was a body of water in between. So he actually turns his eye towards Russia, and this is going to be a huge mistake. Now, this is his plan of invasion. He invades in the year 1812, and the Russians met him at the gate pretty much, and they kind of thought he was a silly little guy. I mean, they had heard all kinds of things about Napoleon through the years. He had gone to Egypt and shot the nose off the Sphinx, and he had found the Rosetta Stone to interpret the hieroglyphs and things like that. But to think that, Russians are kind of hardcore, and for them, a Frenchman to come into Russia and think they're going to take him over, come on. So they let his troops in, and they kept luring them deeper and deeper and deeper into Russia until they hit St. Petersburg, which is pretty far in. And they timed it just right, the Russians did, so that these silly little Frenchmen were there in the middle of a Russian winter. And they were totally, completely unprepared for that. So of 600,000 men, less than 20,000 of them went home to France. It was a complete disaster, and he is never going to get over that. Now, if you look at click again, you can see a picture, kind of a representation of what it would have been like for those poor Frenchmen who literally froze to death. They had no idea what they were in for when they signed on to go to Russia. But he was not going to let them back down. He said, "You will fight to the death," and most of them did. Now, Napoleon did, like I said, did do great things, but after this, he went home basically in shame, and Napoleon abdicates or gives up his throne. And he is held before the court and sentenced to exile in Elba. And they tried to do it with as much respect as possible. There were 12,000 people on the island of Elba, and he was made the ruler of Elba. He wasn't made a prisoner, he was made the ruler, but he was not allowed to leave the island. And he was allowed to keep the title of emperor. Some people look back on that. A lot of historians say that that was kind of a way of making fun of him. We'll let you be emperor of a little tiny island. Others say no, that it was a sign of respect to allow him to keep a title that they thought he had earned. You can look at it either way. But Napoleon was a crafty guy. He stayed there about a year. And he actually did make some new laws in Elba and made things a little bit better for people there. And people thought that he was happy there, that he was ready to retire, and he had accepted his fate. He was 45 years old. Back then, that's pretty old. So people thought he had accepted his fate and kind of loosened the guards a little bit, and he escaped and decided that he was going to go back to France. So Napoleon is going to come back, right? Soldiers actually welcomed him in. The government was not happy that he was there. The Congress of Vienna actually called him an outlaw and kind of put an APB out on him, such as it was back then. But it didn't work out too well for Napoleon anyway. He's only going to rule for about 100 days. And he decides that he's going to go against some British forces. And if he succeeds, then that will prove to everybody, the Congress and his own soldiers and everybody, that he's still worthy to rule. So he goes after this British force, who is controlled by a man by the name of Wellington. And they meet in this place called Waterloo. And there is this huge storm that kind of holds things off. They had fought a little bit prior to the storm coming in and the troops kind of separating and waiting out the storm. And I think Napoleon must have gotten a little bit afraid. And he actually had a chef. Of course, he had to have a chef with him. That's part of the military back then. He had a chef come up with a brand new meat dish and present it to Wellington as kind of a bribery to go away and let him live to fight another day. He realized that Wellington was going to kick his butt. That's where we get beef Wellington from. It was actually created at Waterloo for Wellington and as a bribe. But Wellington, of course, said, nope, great food, but nope, not going for that. So he is going to actually lose the battle at Waterloo. A lot of documentation has been done about the Battle of Waterloo, and Napoleon had this rule that his men should follow him into battle, that they should look to him for direction. He wasn't very good at letting other people know what the plan was. People were constantly looking to find him and seeing the signals that he was giving off, what to do next. And Napoleon was ill that day and had to keep getting off his horse. According to a lot of eyewitness accounts, he got off of his horse a lot. So when the men went to go look for a signal from him, he wasn't anywhere to be found. And some people say that he had the flu and was running to the bathroom. Now, we don't know for sure if that's true, but diarrhea could have been the cause for him losing Waterloo. But whatever the reason was, he was exiled. And this time he's exiled to a very small island named St. Helena. And he's going to live there for about 6 years under very, very tight guard. And he slowly dies there. He just keeps getting sicker and sicker. Some studies indicate that he may have been poisoned with arsenic. but we don't know for sure that that's true. Supposedly, there was a scientific crew that did some DNA testing on him and a bunch of other tests and found traces of arsenic. But we don't know if that's true. He may have just gotten sick and died. We'll probably never know. But anyway, he lived there for 6 years and then passed away, and that was the end of Napoleon. So let's talk a little bit about the legacy of Napoleon, just to kind of wrap things up a little bit, give you a little bit of a review. Don't forget, he is the one responsible for the Napoleonic Code. He is also the one responsible for the creation of nationalism. Public education is a real big thing too. So he also, believe it or not, there is this idea of European domination. You could even look back at history and say there is a lot of similarities between what Germany did in World War II and what Napoleon attempted to do during his reign. So that idea of European domination, to take over all of Europe and create one single controlling entity out of it, which was Germany's plan too, and Napoleon's plan. A lot of references are made in Hitler's diaries, and strategic journals are referenced to Napoleon. So he definitely was a hero of his, but you know how big the connection is, we may never know. Anyway, that's Napoleon Bonaparte. So the Congress of Vienna, remember, this is the Congress that was created in France with the constitutional monarchy. There's a Congress now, even though Napoleon tried to be, the only guy. There's still a Congress. So you can see Europe in 1789. That's before Napoleon came in. This is the French Revolution, and you can see all these little provinces and municipalities. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of little tiny kingdoms all over the place in 1789. Now by 1812, after Napoleon came through, it's much more cleaned up, much more unified. But looking at the map as a member of Congress of Vienna, looking at these two maps and trying to figure out, okay, we can't keep stolen land. Basically, these countries want their monarchs back, but do we go back to this huge hodgepodge of little teeny tiny kingdoms, or do we clean it up a little bit? We want to surround France with stronger countries so this can never happen again. And if we give all those little municipalities their individual power back, that's not going to happen. So let's see what they end up doing. All right, so they have several goals. First, they're going to restore the balance of power in Europe, which means restoring the monarchies. You can't have only French people in control, French people related to Napoleon in control of all these countries. So they restore the balance of Europe by restoring the monarchies. Then a new political map of Europe is drawn, and they do end up surrounding France with very powerful countries, but they maintained a balance of power. They didn't want any country, whether it was Spain or France or whoever, to get too powerful, so they were careful about the land division. Land does equal power, so they were careful about the land division to make sure that no one country would get too carried away. There is a new thing that comes out during this Congress of Vienna meeting. People aren't really sure how best to go about things, and you end up getting two political parties, and they might sound very familiar to you. It was conservatives who liked the way that things were, and they wanted to restore all the former monarchs in all the countries that Napoleon had taken over. But then you had a second group called liberals. They were considered the enlightened ones, and they wanted new governments in all the countries that Napoleon had taken over and now they were withdrawing from. They wanted new governments based on written constitutions in all of those places. So you do have these two political entities, these separate poles developing, which we still have today. Now, the Congress of Vienna tried really hard to be fair. You can see here, again, I gave you the map of 1789, but now instead of the map after Napoleon, you have the map after the Congress of Vienna and the way that they decided to divide Europe. So it's not that hodgepodge anymore, but you have an awful lot of people that lost power and were merged in with other countries, sometimes against their will. And you also have this new idea of nationalism, and all of that wound up together, and the thought that now you have an American Revolution that was successful, you have a French Revolution that was successful. People all over the world are going to say, we want our freedom. We are better than the people who are controlling us. Or who are these people to tell us where our boundary lines are or what kind of country we're going to have? And by the year 1848, and I know it sounds like a really long time away from 1815, but it took that long. You remember, there's no telephones, there's no Google, there's none of that stuff. So it took till 1848 for word to really get out across the world about the successes and the idea of nationalism, and why should you fight for the name of a country? Why do you care if you're French or you're Spanish? All of that kind of comes to a head in 1848, and you have this huge series across the world of revolutions. Almost all of them are going to be unsuccessful, but it just is this widespread discontent in Europe, but also in Latin America, and these unsuccessful revolutions just everywhere. Now, you definitely do not have to write any of this down. I just wanted to kind of give you a peek at what was going on in 1848, and I could have 30 pages just like this if I told you everything that was going on across the world. But every place that you see listed here was having some kind of an uprising or a revolt, and on top of all of that, we had gold discovered in California, so California is going to want to be a state overnight. Women in America are going to meet for their very first time and demand suffrage for the very first time. And the fact that they chose 1848 was a death sentence for them, because there was so much going on across the world that our political leaders just did not have time to deal with it. So not a good choice for them, but they didn't do that on purpose. That's also when the Irish potato famine hit its peak, when Irish were literally dying from starvation. And God help America, that's the year that my family came over here too, because of the potato famine. But you can see all these other places that are listed that were having all kinds of revolts and different things that were going on. So that's just kind of a peek at it. But it is the year that the world literally went to hell, and it's going to take a long time to get over that. So I told you a really long story. I hope you followed it okay. And that is it for the French Revolution and Napoleon.